Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
Hi, I'm Freddie deBoer. I blog at a place, I think it's pronounced Sloat. I should probably know how to pronounce my own blog, but
Yeah, I've always wondered that, actually. How do you pronounce that?
it's Lhote, which is both the guest and the host in French, which was a joke about how I started off as a commenter and became a blogger, but I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce the name of my own blog. So,
Um, well, let's start today by talking about the ongoing story of the Boston bomber, or bombers, or the attack on the Boston Marathon. There's two suspects, one dead, one currently undergoing interrogation, and has already appeared in court and was finally read his Miranda rights by a judge, was not initially read them in the hospital, where he was apparently communicating with investigators by writing stuff on a pen and pad. And it's been pretty much the biggest story in America going on ever since the bombing happened. So, what are you thinking about with relation to this story?
well, I would separate a couple things, and I think that it's really important to separate them, which is the sort of the emotional devastation of an attack like this, which I feel as keenly, I hope, as I feel about any other, violent crime, intentional violent crime, which is terrible, and the sort of the moral revulsion at what happened, which is profound. But I also recognize it as an incident where the territorial integrity of the United States wasn't threatened, where the threat to the average American was nil, where it wasn't anything that sort of represents an existential threat to the United States. And in the time since then, we've seen, that literal term, existential, which an existential threat is a threat that threatens the existence as we know it of something. And I think that 12 years after 9/11, or almost, we continue to mistake the necessary emotional and moral reaction to these events with the even more necessary practical reaction to the events. And when I say things to people like, which are true, like you're more likely to drown in your bathtub than you are to be killed by terrorists. People get very upset about that, and I recognize that there's a deep moral and emotional difference. But I also recognize that, as adults and as people who are trying to be self-interested, we have to recognize that difference between our emotional and moral reaction to these events and our practical reaction to them.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was really fascinating to me to watch in the aftermath of the attack. It seemed to me, and this is a really hard thing to verify in any concrete way. My impression of the media coverage after the event and the national reaction is kind of this amorphous thing where all we can do is observe the people around us and what we see on blogs and Twitter and the media. And so with the caveat that we can't be certain about these things, it seemed to me that right after the attack, before we knew who it was, that there was this kind of impulse summed up in the phrase, keep calm and carry on. And the idea was that this was a terrible thing. It was a tragedy. We want to, go give blood. We want to help the people involved. We want to figure out who did this. But we're not going to let it change the way we think about, change our way of life. We're not going to let it scare us, cow us into not running in the next marathon. And then the suspects were identified, and there was this shootout with police. There was an officer at MIT killed, which of course just adds to the tragedy. And then there was a shootout with police in Watertown, and one of the suspects got away and was at large for a while. And at that point, there seemed to be a lot more kind of panic and anxiety. And I don't know, it's been interesting for me to watch, because it seemed as if either some part of putting a face to this crime, or perhaps the wall-to-wall media coverage that accompanied the shootout, and then the locking down of most of Boston and especially Watertown, it almost seemed to affect people more profoundly than the bombing itself. And I felt that way a little bit myself. I mean, it didn't change the way, it didn't change the policy response that I want to see. But it was definitely more kind of addictive and anxiety inducing at the same time to watch events in Watertown unfold than it was to know that a bombing took place at the finish line of the Boston Marathon and to, be saddened by it and hope that everyone was okay and that they caught whoever did it. It was just a very different thing to watch this neighborhood on lockdown, which itself provoked a lot of different reactions in me, both, hoping that all of the people there were safe and that they got the guy, and also hoping that this isn't something that becomes a regular thing where authorities come and shut down whole neighborhoods because, one person is at large. So I don't know if you felt that same way, or if you had a different reaction to watching the media coverage unfold. But it got me thinking about how the media should cover these kinds of things, and if there's ever any way to even talk about that or change it, or if in the aftermath of these events there's just always going to be this kind of intense free-for-all that's going to dominate national conversation until it resolves itself.
I mean, you and I both lived through September 11th as adults, but it's worth saying that was pre-Twitter, and it was certainly not pre-internet, but that we didn't experience it in the same way. I think that one thing that's important to point out is that while September the 11th, the phenomenon is still ongoing. I mean, we're still living in a post-9/11 world in a lot of ways. The attack itself was over fairly quickly. I mean, it took a matter of hours. And again, because we weren't suffused in quite as much immediacy in opinions and reactions, we just hadn't had this multiplication effect yet of so many voices all at once. I think the fact that the attack itself was over, by the time the fourth plane ended up in that field, to watch a terrorist sort of activity, if in fact that's what this is, play out in real time, I think is, it's necessarily going to invoke a little bit more fear, because you sort of say, well, wait a minute, this event is ongoing. Oh, should I live in Boston, or should I know somebody who lives in Boston? To me, there's a sort of a matched fear, and I guess this is the kind of thing that a lot of people really can't understand feeling this way. But I simultaneously felt terror at the idea of more people getting killed, which they did, of more violence, of further attacks, and I was simultaneously afraid of what this attack would be used to justify in terms of eroding civil liberties, and if it turned out to be Muslim perpetrators, in sort of the continuing scrutiny of Muslims. I mean, I've been straightforward in the past, and I think that our treatment of Muslim people writ large since September 11th is going to go down as one of the great crimes in the history of the United States of America. And I had both those things going, and they're very different kind of fears, but I think that they're both legitimate. But I know, and I talked to people personally who, sort of couldn't imagine that I would be worrying about sort of anti-Muslim reprisals at the same time as these people were still at large.
Yeah, I felt both of those things, and I think that it bears emphasizing that those impulses, although there are a lot of people who maybe can't conceive of having both of them, they're not contradictory in any way. And the fact that some people can't wrap their minds around them not being contradictory has really begun to bother me in recent days. There are a couple of conversations where I was following. One was between Glenn Greenwald and Andrew Sullivan, where in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, they were, or I guess in the immediate aftermath of the suspects being arrested, they were arguing about whether we knew that this was jihadism, motivated by radical Islam or not. And Greenwald was saying, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We should kind of not assume one way or another. And Sullivan was saying, of course, it's jihadism, and was very bothered by Greenwald not being willing to say that yet. And I kind of weighed in and said, if I had to put money on it, I guess I would bet that it's probably jihadism, but we don't have to put money on it. We don't. There's no cost to waiting. We've seen in the past that there's a huge cost to getting the wrong analytic framework and that we've been wrong about lots of things in the war on terrorism. So, why not wait? But I guess more importantly, like, why be bothered by people who are waiting? Why act as if this is some kind of a threat to us? And today I wrote a piece about Mark Stein writing in National Review as if the media was somehow ignoring the possibility that radical Islam was behind this, was like soft pedaling Islamic extremism. And, he had a few links to like a Think Progress piece and a couple of commentaries by MSNBC's Melissa Harris-Perry. And, I kind of went through and basically showed that every major national news gathering organization in America is actively throwing resources at reporting out the possible radical Islam angle of this story, and is, reporting on it pretty forthrightly. Like, they were watching these websites and this is what their family members say. And, one of them visited Russia and maybe met with extremists there. And, all of the little pieces of information that lead us to think that maybe this is, a jihadist attack. And there's just simultaneous belief on the right. It's like they'll cite all of this information that was unearthed by reporters in the quote-unquote mainstream media. And yet they'll say at the same time, well, the mainstream media is just ignoring the radical Islam. They're not even willing to talk about that. It's an ideological thing, and they won't confront the enemy that we're up against. And I just think it's just so totally without basis in fact and so easily contradicted by just looking at the front page of any newspaper in America that it's just really frustrating me these last few days, that aspect of it.
Yeah, I said in response to Andrew Sullivan, and he linked to it because he's always very good about engaging criticism. I said,
absolutely.
Obviously that's an important conversation to have. Like, there's a level in which the answer is, were they motivated by radical Islam? That specific question, there's a level to which the answer is who cares, right? Because when we say, are they motivated by radical Islam, what actually matters for the sort of strategic response of this country is, are they part of a larger network of Islamic extremists or whatever, to which we have to attend to militarily or with our intelligence service or whatever? All the evidence, including the younger Tsarnaev brother, indicates that that's not the case, that they were working just the two of them. Who knows? We'll find out. But, the specific motivation, like when you find the specific motivation of Islam, okay, even if they say, yeah, that's exactly why we did it. My question is always, so what do we do about it? One of the things that I'm frequently frustrated by is someone like Bill Maher or, people all over the political spectrum who say, well, we need to get real and recognize that the problem here is Islam. And I always say, okay, but what do you want to do about it, right? I think that someone like Pamela Geller is a monstrosity, but I think that she is very frank in saying, okay, our enemy is radical Islam, so here's these terrible civil liberties destroying things that we should do. You can find people online who think that Muslims should be put in camps or that they should be forced to register. You can find people online who think that the Quran should be banned. That's a response that I at least understand, because it says, okay, once we've identified this as Islam or jihad, whatever that means, then here's the actions that we take. And so my question for Andrew or for Bill Maher, for a lot of people is, if it is, what do you materially want to do? Because there's plenty of people in this country who want to respond to jihad by taking really sort of hardcore anti-Muslim measures. I know that Andrew doesn't want to do that. I know that Bill Maher doesn't want to do that. But then, so what do you want to do? Like, what is the purpose of having this conversation if you can't express any difference in terms of what you materially want to respond with?
Yeah, I guess I guess I'm in partial agreement with you. My frustration is a little different, though. It's that after 9/11, if you read the 9/11 Commission report, and after this attack too, given the information that we have, albeit on a preliminary basis, there are things that you can do that would address kind of how the specific circumstances unfolded, right? So, we've heard about how Russia asked to look into the extremism of these of the older brother, the older Sarnoff brother, who's one of the suspects, right? Mm-hmm. And so, do we take these kinds of things seriously? I'm kind of the opinion that we should be very wary of what the Russian Secret Service tells us, the Russian Secret Police tells us. But sure, worth looking into if we take these kinds of tips seriously enough. He was apparently active in online forums that were jihadist related. Do we have FBI resources that are looking at those forums for people who are going to go the actual step of perpetrating violence? There's all kind. Whether you agree with any of them or not, there's all kinds of specific things you can look at about this case or about 9/11, and you can think, okay, well maybe that would be a tweak that would make us a little bit better off next time without unduly impinging on anyone's civil liberties, right? But the people who claim to be the most serious about fighting terrorism and who are talking about how the other people lack seriousness, those kinds of things are never their response. Instead, you have Michael Bloomberg saying that the Boston attack shows that we need more surveillance cameras because, New Yorkers know this, he said, because of 9/11, and Bostonians know it now. Like, no, there were surveillance cameras that caught them on tape. It didn't stop the bombing. Surveillance cameras wouldn't have stopped 9/11. You might think that surveillance cameras are a good idea, but to invoke this attack in service of them is a non sequitur. It's an ideological response just as much as Dick Cheney saying, we should invade Iraq because of this attack, because, that's what my worldview was before, and this just confirms it. Again, I just think that there's this thread of running through a lot of commentary that's like, if you don't support these very specific responses, you're not serious about the threat of terrorism. If you thought that maybe this wasn't Islamic terrorism, or you wanted to investigate the facts before you jump to that conclusion, you're not serious about the war that has come upon us. And I would just say no. I'm sure that at some fringe of some weird part of the political spectrum, there is someone who isn't sufficiently concerned about Islamic terrorism. But as far as I can tell, basically everyone is perfectly willing to acknowledge it when it is, in fact, an attack motivated by radical Islam. Like, once the facts are in, and we know that for sure, people are willing to say, yes, that's true, and they're willing to prosecute these people to the full extent of the law. And, so there are disagreements about what the best way to respond to terrorism is. But this idea that there's like a significant segment of America that just doesn't care about terrorism and doesn't get the threat that we face is just ridiculous to me. It's like, of course, if there's anything to worry about, it's erring in the other direction, because that's exactly what we've done for the last 12 years.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a response, a response that has been offered by a lot of different people as a way to reduce the risk of being the victims of Islamic terrorism, and that's one that is not entertained seriously by most people in both political parties, which is to stop exporting violence ourselves. I have what I think of as a principled and moral aversion to things like, to the drone program, or to NATO dropping bombs on Libya, or to the whole host of just the endless amount of the export of American ordnance into the Muslim world. But, it seems to me that there's a case to be made that is purely self-interested against doing that. I mean, Greenwald has made the point over and over again that every time one of these things happens, the justification is not, I'm blowing you up because the Quran tells me to. The first justification is always because of things that America has done in the Muslim world. I mean, and we continue to have this inability to sort a justification from a motive, right? There is no justification for what the Tsarnaev brothers did, just like there's no justification for the 9/11 attacks. There's no justification for an Iraqi insurgent planting an IED. But there is a motivation, and that the way to address these things and to make them less common in the future is to provide them with less reason to want to hurt us. And it just seems to me to be an empirical reality that the more violence that you export outside of your own country, the more comes back to you. And that I don't understand why people from a purely self-interested standpoint don't say, maybe we should try not constantly killing people in other countries, not constantly destabilizing other people's countries, not imposing our will on the world. Maybe that's something we should try out as a way to reduce the possibility of being the victims of terrorism.
Yeah, I think part of the confusion maybe is that people have this aversion to changing their behavior based on what terrorists do, and it's an understandable aversion in many ways, right? So, if it really were the case that we were just being attacked because in the United States we treat women more equally than they're treated in other places in the world, and if we were really being attacked for that freedom, as people like to say. Then of course we shouldn't change our policy in order to make us less vulnerable to attack. On the other hand, and Bob Wright made this point really well recently, if it's something like the drone campaign, right, where the only purpose of it is supposedly to keep us safe from terrorism, well, if the only purpose of it is to keep us safe from terrorism, and that policy is in fact creating more terrorists than it kills, that's a good policy to abandon because of how extremists react to it. And I think that there's a very good case to be made that that's exactly what our drone policy did. I just wrote about this young Yemeni guy who got State Department scholarships and studied in the United States and has basically as passionate a love for America as I've ever heard anyone in the Middle East or even in America articulated. This guy's really thankful that he was taken out of his impoverished village and given an education by United States-funded scholarships. And he is now a democracy activist and a kind of ambassador for America in Yemen. He's basically, exactly the guy that, in the best-case scenario, our State Department policies would produce, and exactly the guy that we want in that part of the world. And he's basically saying, I go around Yemen and I see that every time a drone explodes and kills innocent people, it helps Al-Qaeda here. You're helping Al-Qaeda here. You're creating enemies of America where you never had them. And, the idea that this argument is just totally unaddressed by supporters of the drone campaign drives me nuts. It's like the Obama administration doesn't come out and say, well, yes, we've weighed the costs of it against the benefits. It just kind of keeps going with it and never addresses the cost component at all, never gives us reason to believe they've even seriously considered the amount of blowback, perhaps because it doesn't fit within the incentive system of the President of the United States, who's gone in 4 years. And I'm not saying that Obama is just callously indifferent to what happens after that. But the nature of the job is to focus on the moment and not having an attack tomorrow, perhaps to the detriment of a larger strategic goal.
Yeah, I mean, addressing that argument, unfortunately, would require Obama to acknowledge that the drone program exists outside of telling jokes about it at the press correspondence dinner or whatever it's called.
So you wanted to... Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I mean, just, and I would argue... The burden of proof should not be on you to prove that things like the drone program reduce terrorism. The burden of proof should be on the people who make the affirmative case that they are reducing terrorism to prove it. So Jennifer Rubin put out a column recently. She said Bush was great because he kept us safe, because he had a heavy hand in the war and he tortured whatever. And she just displayed absolutely no notion that that's a point she has to prove. And one of the things that drives me crazy is people who defend our ultra-aggressive, militaristic response to 9/11 just feel like you can just argue by assertion that they're keeping us safe. We don't know how they're doing it. I can't prove where the enemy is. I don't know who the enemy is. I don't know who they're killing in Yemen, but they're killing bad guys, and so we should be happy.
Right. So you wanted to talk about how media is changing. The age of digital media, and I'll let you kick things off.
Yeah, I just think you and I have both been writing online for a long time. You professionally, and I am sort of a dedicated amateur, I guess. I'm the guy that is, unfortunately, maybe tracking people's wages down in the online content generation business. I think that it's old enough now to have gone through a couple different evolutions. One of the questions that I always ask myself is, looking at sort of a voice will come up, the voice in the blogosphere, somebody independent usually, or occasionally it's a new hire at one of the usual suspects like the Atlantic. And that voice suddenly just sounds like the most vital and necessary voice, and you have this kind of a perfect match of, a new voice to an issue that is important. I would argue that Glenn Greenwald started out that way. I think that he's still very vital because, unfortunately, we're still doing all the things that we were doing when he became prominent. But, and then they just sort of keep going. And one of the things I've always asked myself is, should a blogger be like a sitcom where you go, 6 years and then you retire to syndication or whatever? Or should it be like the nightly news where you keep going on and on and on? Blogs are still new enough where, I can't think of many major bloggers who have just decided to sort of stop. But, there was, John Schwenkler was a guy who I liked a lot who decided to hang it up. But, I'm always wondering, when should you stop? Because the reason why, like a sitcom or a drama goes off the air is because the voice becomes stale or they don't have anything intelligent to say anymore. And I always wonder, is there a time when you should sort of say, okay, I've said my bit and it's time to sort of segue to something different?
Yeah. I don't know. I think for some people, for some people there is a time to stop, and for others not, I guess. I think, first of all, blogging it's exhausting to write at that pace. And not a lot of people have been able to sustain it. The people who've made it to getting paid to blog for a living are, very weird kind of subsection. There are tons of blogs that people did for a few years and they quit doing, even people who were widely read. There's a lot of people who kind of quit and then come back to it because they can't stay away. And, I definitely do find that occasionally I'll be reading a blog and I'll think this is kind of stale. And I've kind of read it all already. And sometimes I think that that's because the person has lost interest in the blog. Sometimes I think, you notice I don't know if you ever read the blog Instapundit, but it was a blog that I followed back in 2001 when I started reading blogs, and that I've kind of intermittently checked back at over the years. And it's changed a lot in that it's just kind of a link blog now. It's almost like a Twitter account. And it used to be that Glenn Reynolds kind of jumped in with his opinion more. Right. And I think in his case, the fact that it's become a link blog has made it there's a formula for the kind of politics that he likes and the kind that he doesn't like, and he just kind of links what he likes and doesn't engage with what he doesn't very much, except for the things that he's mocking. I like the Instapundit voice. I like Glenn Reynolds at law review article length and op-ed length a lot more than I like his at blog length voice. Andrew Sullivan has changed a lot over the years, and he used to write stuff that was a lot more long and essayish, and I think he couldn't have sustained the stamina of doing it if not for bringing in other people to help him. Bringing in people like Patrick Appel and Chris Bodiner that really kind of get his voice and the kind of curation that he wants to do. And so I think that that model is a good one. Ezra Klein has followed it too, of kind of establishing the kind of journalism that you want to do. And if you can build up a good enough audience that you can pay for it, bring in people that you think are really good. And I know that Ezra thinks that the people he's hired are really good at what they do, and I know that Andrew thinks the same thing. And they're putting out they've become editors of their own mini publications, and I think that's one route. Had I been blogging straight since 2001, I'd probably be exhausted by it now if I were trying to read up 8 posts a day or something. What I'm doing at the Atlantic is kind of an interesting genre, right? Because some of it is like a traditional magazine article, my longer pieces, but a lot of it is kind of not not exactly a blog post. I never start by just saying like, so and so said this the other day. Actually, I think this. It's framed with a beginning, but it's not quite a magazine article either. It's in this kind of like in between world, and I think one thing that I've learned at the Atlantic, one reason that I've been grateful for this like new kind of non-blogging position. One, I don't have to put out quite as much content every day, and I can write longer things and do more research. And that must sound absurd to someone who goes off and reports something for 3 months that I'm saying this, posting like 2 articles a day. But it's really true. I can read a 300-page report and take 6 hours to really think about it, and then another 3 hours to write about it, right? And doing that over 2 days while doing like a couple other things isn't something that I could have done when I was working for Andrew.
I can't. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just say one more thing before you jump in. But one thing that is different from when I was blogging to what I'm doing at the Atlantic is like, a lot of times I'll be responding to the same thing. I'll see an argument somewhere and I'll think, okay, this argument that I've just seen at the corner is like something I want to respond to, and I think it's wrong, and I think it's important to point out why it's wrong. But I'm a lot better now about trying to frame the conversation in a way that anyone on the internet coming to it could get into it, as opposed to like a closed circle of people who read me every day and who know all of the personalities involved. And I think that the professionalization of the blogosphere, I guess, has had some effects that I don't like. But one effect that I do like is that a lot of us who are working for magazines that get traffic from just like anywhere on the internet, stuff, people share stuff on Facebook or send around links or it gets on Reddit or something, are being forced to broaden our notion of who our audience is to anyone. And I think that that's a healthy thing, and that it wasn't such a healthy thing where it was just like you could refer to Matt or Ezra by their first name and assume that all of your readers knew what that was, instead of like framing them and saying this person with this set of beliefs. So I think that's been a good effect of changing media.
Yeah, a few things for one thing, like it's funny you mentioned Instapundit because, right, like in 2001 or whenever he started, like, hey, it's an instant pundit, right? An Instapundit, right? Like that was like a distinguishing thing. And now it's like sometimes I think, oh, you're an Instapundit, like absolutely every other human in our culture,
Right.
But you're talking, you're talking about this drudge effect where eventually it just seems like everybody becomes an aggregator. And I think the reality is that for it to work financially, you have to be publishing all the time. You have to be hitting post after post after post. I think that some people do that very well, and some people don't do it as well. I think that I look at a publication like Gawker, where they seem to have people on their payroll whose explicit kind of decree is you just put content as much as you can, and that will subsidize our longer form journalism and our bigger think pieces and stuff like that. And I think that they do it well. For one thing, for me is, number one is just that I am obsessive about writing. Compulsive to the point of not being able to sleep, which helps. I probably write between different tasks and media probably 10 or 12,000 words a week. But I can't tell you how much it helps that I don't have to do this. Like, I talk to people about their sort of blogger burnout, and it's a problem that I don't really have in the same way that they do, because tomorrow, if I decided not to post for a week, I won't post for a week, right? And it's not just the pace of the blogging, but it's the requirement that you maintain that pace. And anything that you have to do is more tiring than something that you don't have to do. I think that there's still, it's funny because we've been going through all these sort of turns and evolutions, and I think there's still lots of unexplored places or unexplored spaces. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates at your publication is a good example of someone who, has obviously has the prose chops and talks about a specific range of issues, but he also, one of the things that he did that other people didn't do was he allowed himself to be in this sort of ruminative sort of mode where he might post 2 days after what everybody else has already posted about, but that he uses that to his advantage. And I think that there's, as bleak as it is out there, and I should say that I'm a skeptic about the long-term financial viability of most people who want to write online for a living. But I still think that if you just want people to read you, I think that there are places to play in. But it's so hard to get away from the dominant model of an Yglesias or a Klein or like an Atrios,
Yeah, I don't know. I think so. One qualification that I would offer is that let me throw out two simplified models of how a profitable publication might work. One of them is, in fact, we'll call it like, so there's the blog model, right, where you're just putting up a ton of content, and people are coming back multiple times every single day. They're spending a ton of time on your site. If you think of like the page views that Andrew Sullivan was generating when he was still at the Daily Beast on that model, right? If there's a direct relationship between the amount of posts that he publishes and his traffic every day, and there's just no getting around it in that model. And what you're trying to do is build a readership for the blog and get as many people coming back to it as possible, right? And that's a very different model than the Atlantic Online, which started with that model, right? Which started with when they were trying to figure out what are we going to do online. The first answer was hire Andrew Sullivan and Matthew Yglesias and Megan McArdle and Ross Douthat and have them write things online and have them write, hope they're good things. We think that they're people who can write well and are going to do it thoughtfully and like, okay, this is what we'll do. The Atlantic now, without getting too deep into the weeds, there's less of a relationship between the number of posts and traffic and more of a relationship between the quality of posts and traffic. And the posts that do the best are not necessarily what you would think. Like, it's partly because of what people are coming to the Atlantic for. So, like, if we put up a post that would have done really big on BuzzFeed, it might just die at the Atlantic. It's just a matter of, like, what our audience wants and what our audience is going to share. But when I spend a long time on a piece, when I write something that I think is particularly good, it's almost always rewarded with higher traffic. And if you look at like the traffic distribution of my pieces, so I wrote that long piece that was summarizing the grand jury report in the trial of Dr. Kermit Gosnell. And that post, took a long time to write. It was reading a really long report and trying to distill it in a way that was, that did justice to this whole big, huge document, and also tried to have like add some analytic value of like how it was being handled in the media. So on a blogging model, that post wouldn't have been worth the time because it would have just been like one post, and I would have spent all day on it. I wouldn't have posted anything else to the blog that day, and my regular readers would have only clicked on one entry and instead of like 10 entries, right? I would have been seriously reducing my page views and my livelihood, presumably. In fact, that post did so much better than, that post generated more page views at the Atlantic than like probably everything else I wrote this month combined. And you don't always know what post is going to go viral, what post is going to get shared by a bunch of people on Facebook, what post is going to like make the rounds on Reddit, whatever. But it makes a lot more sense to take time and invest in something that you think is going to add a lot of value or be like really different, as opposed to just like chipping in a very small point about a bunch of different things. And so, who knows how sustainable any of these models are. But I am heartened by like both that dynamic at the Atlantic and also the kind of like long reads economy that's growing up around places like Byliner and the Atavist, where people are willing to pay, $1.99 if they have the expectation that it's going to be this like long, deeply researched thing. And what I hope happens is that what goes away are the kind of like just the things that don't add much value beyond generating extra page views. And I think that the web is going in that direction. I think that, and I think now that Andrew Sullivan is on a different model, you're probably going to see content that's maybe a little bit longer than you did before, and a little bit more, and maybe a little bit less aggregation. But I guess we'll see about the dish. I don't have any inside knowledge about that.
Yeah, I guess that is a surprise, right? That now that he's on a subscription model, he's it doesn't appear that he's offering any less aggregation than he used to. I think that Andrew does something that's different, I think, than what a lot of people do. It's funny thinking about him leaving the Atlantic, and please don't take this as a dig at all. I think that the Atlantic I think the Atlantic is a good example of a website that has a kind of ESPN or MTV model instead of a sort of Dancing with the Stars model. And what I mean by that is, so years ago, ESPN was having some kind of high-profile contract disputes with some of its anchors, some of whom they let go. And they, not coincidentally in my mind, came out with a show called Dream Job, which was they picked, they had a reality show to have somebody come in and be an ESPN anchor. And the not very subtle message of that was to the people who were asking for more money was, you're kind of replaceable. Or if you look at MTV, MTV knows that celebrities are expensive, so they have this road rules, real world sort of feeder system, which creates these kind of mini celebrities who they then populate the rest of their shows with. If you look at the dating shows that VH1 used to do, it was, first it was Date Flavor Flav, but then it was Date the Lovelorn girl from Flavor Flav's show. And I think that part of what the Atlantic is able to do because of its pedigree is to make the website itself the attraction, where it used to be, we've got Andrew Sullivan and Meghan McArdle and Matt Yglesias and really big names. Now, obviously, people become big names in part through that, like Ta-Nehisi Coates or yourself, but I think that there's...
Ross, I would say became a big name at the Atlantic.
Yeah, so, it's I think that that is something where, depending on how you look at it, that's good or bad. For some people, that is a betrayal of what the original purpose of the blogosphere was, right? Which was that individual voices were going to be elevated beyond sort of establishment media. But on the other hand, I think it's infinitely more sustainable than the sort of, I had a blog in 2002, so somebody give me a job model, which still kind of dominates today.
Well, I guess, so one thing that, without focusing too much on the Atlantic, which is obviously more interesting to me than most people, because I work there, the Atlantic Online has invested a lot in staff. They've invested money in hiring more people, and the editorial staff has grown steadily, like every year. They've hired more full-time employees, as opposed to investing that in freelance content, say. I think that I think that is a good thing. Obviously, it depends on what staff you hire. But I think someone like Ta-Nehisi is able to do awesome things that he couldn't do as a freelancer by virtue of being a staffer at the Atlantic, right? That he couldn't do if he were just running his own blog. I think that's an awesome thing. I do, on the other hand, lament the fact that the blogosphere has kind of gone away, a lot of it. And I know there are still a lot of great blogs out there. I read a lot of great blogs out there. But, I was talking to, who was I talking to this about? I forget. Someone involved with the American scene, which, for those who don't know, was something that Ross Douthat and Raihan Salam put together. And Raihan was the main one that was going out and, finding people to write on it. And he somehow had this idea that, if Alan Jacobs and Noah Millman and Jim Manzi and later me and James Poulos and Peter Suderman, we would all be a good fit, or a blog would be good if we were all writing on it. or something. And it started with him and Ross, and a guy named Steve Menashe, but like over time it grew to all these other people who have like very different kind of takes on the world, I would say. And I don't know if anyone other than Raihan would have like known or gathered up all of these people who live in like very different places around the country, and I have no idea how he meets the people he meets.
He's everywhere.
But yeah, but you know, he was very generous to me as a young writer, and kind of reaching out to me and saying, and you know, helping me get various opportunities in my career, saying, you know, oh, I think you'd be a really good fit here. And at one point, oh, I think you write at the American Scene. And so, God, I'm completely blank on who I was talking to this about, but we were basically saying, you know, a lot of the people at the American Scene have kind of moved on to other media gigs at this point, and not very many people are writing on it anymore. And we were saying, like, who would be the people to throw on at the American Scene if there were like a new young generation of the American Scene, and we don't really know. You know, I try to follow new bloggers, like young voices coming up, and it could totally be that I've just gotten older and I'm living far away from DC, thankfully, and so I'm just not like plugged into young writers who are like trying to make it. But my sense is that people have just started going a different route than going out there with their blog and trying to like get noticed. And I don't know where they've gone really.
Right.
I think some of them have gone to like, you know, Think Progress and the American Prospect and the American Conservative as interns or whatever. But like, it just seems like there's less diversity of voices out there and less new voices and less people that I'm like, oh, I'm really, you know, there's a time in the blogosphere when I was like, oh man, this is awesome. I just discovered this great new voice that I never even conceived of before. And It's been a long time since I've discovered a new voice, and I'm like, oh man, this is different and awesome, and give me more of this.
Well, I'm biased, and something of a crank, but you know, I would say that, to my estimation, it gets more homogenous every day, and I mean, it's you know, comparing now to when I started like 5 years ago, I just think that it's just, I think you're completely right. I have solved this problem in part by rendering myself unemployable at a sort of establishment media thing, and I only partially jokingly say that, you know, there is an issue where people want their work to be read, even beyond, I think, often for some, the fact that they want to be employed. In order to be employed and to get the kind of prominence that comes with a major publication's voice, unless you're starting really early, unless you are Andrew Sullivan, unless you are Kaki, you know, people who started really early, you have to kind of affiliate, usually, almost always, or unless you're Atrios, like, you have to affiliate with a big organization, and big organizations have expectations that I think tend to, over time, erode the things that make individual voices prominent and interesting and provocative. I mean, Ezra Klein kind of famously said after, not Luke Russert, who was Luke Russert's, Tim Russert, that after he died, said something very vulgar about him on Twitter, which I liked. He would never ever do that. Right? You cannot be the face of the Washington Post and say, sort of, take posthumous cracks at a dead guy. And look, I don't.
Well, yeah, that's true, but like, but was taking pot shots at dead guys like an essential part of what made Ezra a different voice when he started?
I mean, I guess it depends on what you like. I mean, not so much for Ezra anymore, but like a guy like Jacob Bacharach, who was IOS, you know, of Who Is IOS, was one of my favorite writers. You know, I don't think that he's going to be, you know, ending up on the New York Times editorial page anytime soon, because he's angry, like I'm angry, and because he's not polite. And look, and I don't mean to make this about me at all. You know. And I'm not saying this at all to big time at all, because obviously, I mean, when your website address ends in .blogspot.com, it's very easy to maintain a good sense of perspective, as I do. I have gotten emails over the 5 years or so that I've done this from very prominent people, like from editors and from people whose who have appeared on Blocking Heads and who have appeared on cable television and stuff, and I've heard from people on several different occasions, I like your work or I like your voice. Why aren't you better behaved? Why don't you have a better filter? And one of the things I always say, is, does everybody have to be this bloodless sort of wonky pundit? I mean, does everybody have to sort of kowtow to this sort of comedy fetishism that is so popular online? I mean, it's always amazing to me when people say, "Oh, online there's the arguments are so ugly," and I think just the opposite. And I think that we want and we should hope for and cultivate voices that are genuinely independent, in the understanding that a genuinely independent voice is going to piss a lot of people off. But the problem is the more independent you are, the less capable you are of hooking on to one of these major media companies or major think tanks or whatever that can raise your profile.
I have mixed feelings about what you're saying, because I mean, in part I agree with you that there is a homogenization of people as they climb the kind of DC journalism career track.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I think that it's possible to distinguish between being an original voice and being well behaved in the way that I assume people mean when they're criticizing you. And I'm not saying that every single case is like a clear line, but so this is a good time to jump into this discussion about Matt Yglesias' blog post. And we'll link it on the sidebar. He was writing about a factory in Bangladesh where there was an accident and a bunch of workers were killed. His post started by saying, he was responding to people who were saying that we need to have better safety standards in Bangladesh so that their workers are as safe as our workers. And Iglesias basically said, I think he started his post by saying, hey, Bangladesh may well need better safety standards, but it's a mistake to say that Bangladeshi safety standards and American safety standards should be the same. It makes sense for different countries at different levels of wealth to have different safety standards. And if we tried to impose American safety standards on Bangladesh, it would, I forget if he said impoverish or immiserate, but something like that. It would impoverish or immiserate the people. And his post was, he did not take time in his post to kind of be sensitive and have a first paragraph that said, of course, this tragedy is very terrible in Bangladesh, and I feel for all the people that died. He certainly could have written the post even without going so far as to write a paragraph like that in a more sensitive way. But I would argue that that his point was, I would argue that his motive was genuinely what would be better for people in Bangladesh, and that his point is a plausible one. Now, why don't you describe the response to this, because I forget the name of the blog, and you wrote about it.
So it's at to Mr. Destructo, and one of the major writer is Jeb Lund, who used to go by the knocked blog of Wabute Seseseku, which is he used to write at, I think I'm saying that right, at Gawker. He's another one of my favorite writers. And along with a co-blogger who goes by the name General Gandhi, and a third guy whose name I'm afraid I'm forgetting at the moment. And they responded, I think, angrily but appropriately. And I just want to sort out a couple things first about that post, which is that, number one, it's not merely that he didn't display sensitivity, but that he displayed that sort of shit-eating, I'm Matt Yglesias, and I just sort of talk shit about everyone all the time kind of thing. I mean, it's not just that he wasn't sensitive. It's that his whole thing is this kind of slate contrarian insensitivity. I'm so proud of what a cute performance I'm putting on for all of you thing. And so it's not just a sin of omission, it's a sin of commission. Second, I think sort of on the merits that there is room and this is a thing that neoliberals do constantly, which drives me crazy, which is there is room for economic growth that happens at the same time as improvement in working conditions and improvement in labor happens. The fact that the Industrial Revolution happened and that human society saw this great advancement in economic growth and in material goods, and that at the same time as that, children were literally being crushed to death in machinery, doesn't mean that children being crushed to death in machinery was a necessary precondition of that growth. And that, in fact, if some of the people at the very top were not becoming so ludicrously enriched through this, we could have provided for that growth anyway. But so they wrote this post. It's better than any response I could have written. I go to Twitter, and by the way, like, they had some very sort of strong points that were expressed in a kind of deliberately hostile fashion because they're angry and they thought it was appropriate to be angry. And
sorry, go ahead. I mean, I don't have any problem with with being angry in writing. I think that someone like Glenn Greenwald is appropriately angry all the time. Mm-hmm. And even if I disagreed with someone and I thought they don't actually have reason to be angry here, still, anger's fine. What I took offense to in that post was three main things. One, that I think that they misrepresented what Yglesias was in fact arguing. Two, I think that they did not have any counter-argument to his actual argument. And I guess maybe we disagree about that. And three, the posts are basically intentionally nasty in almost every way, framing him as someone who maybe likes murder, ridiculing his personal appearance in various ways. And what I objected to specifically in your post about this is where you said, people are upset about that they were ridiculing his personal appearance, and well, I guess that maybe that's not always such a great thing, but I don't see how anyone could be upset about them ridiculing his personal appearance when, on one hand, really rich guy in the halls of DC Power gets his appearance ridiculed, and on the other hand, a bunch of Bangladeshis have died in a factory.
But that's not my argument.
About that, right?
Here's my argument. I turn on Twitter, and people are mad at Jeb London, the other people who wrote this, that they had taken these shots at Matt Yglesias. Okay, you can be mad about that. I understand that argument. To highlight that, and not to highlight what is to me just the sociopathic lack of regard for several hundred human beings who are literally crushed to death by a collapsing building, says absolutely everything about the sort of social circle that has captured the blogosphere. It tells me absolutely everything that people don't react to that by saying, hey, you know what, dude, maybe you shouldn't be sort of pulling out your sort of slate contrarian pants and rubbing your hands together and saying, I'm going to justify this, and I'm going to explicitly justify it by saying people in Bangladesh, it's good for them to have lower safety standards, which, in my opinion, and you're free to disagree, necessarily entails a vision of Bangladeshi life as being less worthy than American life, right? That, to me, the first thing you do is you get mad at Matt Yglesias for saying, hey, you know what, it is totally off limits to sort of suggest that and to do anything other than to say, holy shit, what a horrible tragedy that could have been prevented with better workplace regulation. And it drives me crazy that people like Jeb Lund and the people who wrote with him are sort of operate under this presumption where sort of they're the ones who are poorly behaved because Matt Yglesias writes for a major publication like Slate, and because, he sort of dresses it up in this economic speak, which is a great way to sort of deny the moral valence of what you're actually saying.
See, I think that it's not the fact that Matt Yglesias writes for a publication like Slate that makes them poorly behaved. It's the fact that they took someone and ridiculed at length his physical appearance for no good reason. And, enforcing a norm against something like ridiculing the physical appearance of people like Matt Yglesias, of journalists, right? I would argue that that is a good thing to do, and that you're invoking Matt Yglesias' privilege is completely irrelevant when it comes to talking about that aspect of it. That and this is something that grates on me generally with like invocations of privilege. Like, so yeah, Matt Yglesias like had a book deal and was able to buy like a condo in D.C. and he has comes from a well-educated, wealthy family. Does this mean that it's more wrong or right to treat him with varying levels of respect or humanity or cruelty? Like, no, invoking privilege in that context, I think, is a bullshit move. And I think, additionally, that the way that you react to Yglesias saying, to Yglesias' post, to me, it's almost exactly the same as the way that people react when I respond to the Boston bombing by worrying about civil liberties, right, or by worrying about the foreign policy implications, right, while these people are still in the hospital. These people who, these are the kinds of emails that people like Glenn Greenwald get all the time, right, that you just have callous disregard for these victims, for the 8-year-old that died in the Boston bombing, right, because you're talking about the policy implications of it. No, he doesn't have callous disregard for the 8-year-old. I don't have callous disregard for the 8-year-old. Iglesias doesn't have callous disregard for the Bangladeshis that died. We're all writing what we think is going to address important points and is going to make the world the best place possible. And there's no doubt in my mind that Iglesias earnestly believes that if American standards safety standards were imposed on Bangladesh, the specific thing that he picked out to argue about, it would immiserate Bangladesh. And I agree with him that it would immiserate Bangladesh, which isn't to say that they shouldn't have any safety standards or that they shouldn't have improved safety standards, which he actually acknowledged in his post, that maybe they should have better safety standards. But trying to, if the United States were to pass that law now that no trade with Bangladesh can happen until they have better safety standards, I think that it would immiserate Bangladesh. And, I've talked to people who travel to countries like Bangladesh and Honduras where visit shirt factories. And these are basically like Christian businessmen that I was interviewing who are wrestling with the idea of like, we produce things overseas and we want to go ourselves and see the conditions of the people in the factories. And it's a very hard question of like, you go to a factory and you push for the workers to be treated well. You try to make sure that they're not being abused in any way. And then you come upon something where like I can produce things in Honduras where they have these safety standards, or in Bangladesh where they have these lesser standards. And like if I pull my contract out of here, this factory is going to close, and all these people are going to have no jobs, and some of them are like maybe going to starve to death, literally. On the other hand, maybe if there were different norms for factory workers here, then the factories would have to change to compete, and things would be. I just don't think that there's any like clear moral answer, and that someone with the Iglesias position is plausibly right, and is also certainly, there's no powerful imperative coming down from the DC establishment to be for or against safety standards in Bangladesh. Arguably, it would help America if we passed a law that said that their safety standards had to be the same as ours. There's no like neoliberals are getting money from this think tank, or Matt Yglesias is employed by a corporation, so he takes this view. He could have Matt Yglesias could have taken exactly the opposite position and had all of the same prestige and all of the same support at Slate and everything else. So
in fact, if the Corner had published that piece, the number of blog posts and Twitter and tweets and essays being written about it in total rage right now would be, Chris Hayes would lead his show with it. Everybody would be talking about how awful it is. There's a bunch of things to say there. Number one, we don't have time to go into the reality of globalism and what's best. The conditions that we're talking about are the product of an exploitative system that exists exactly to maintain some international differences across borders and not to eliminate other ones. So that, hey, look, I'm an internationalist. Let's tear the whole system of borders down. That's fine. But of course, they persist exactly to be in order to be able to give American companies the sort of benefits of nationalism while raising the tariff wall and things like that to make it easier for them to make more money. But that's a very long conversation and one we don't have time for. It is not a coincidence that the same process that, yes, contributes to economic growth in Bangladesh, which eventually will help people, but is not happening soon enough, not happening nearly quickly enough, also happens to put more and more resources into the hands of a tiny fraction of people. And in fact, again, I will persist in saying that if you reduce the amount of resources that was going into the hands of that tiny amount of people, you could pay for things like appropriate workplace regulation in order to be able to make that factory both economically efficient and safe. But only if, some asshole somewhere doesn't get his 7th and 8th mansion. But again, that's a separate thing also. Number one, again, I think ethos matters here. And I think that Matthew Yglesias has cultivated a kind of studied rejection of traditional left-wing values. And those traditional left-wing values include things like people are of equal dignity and of equal worth across things like national borders. And that when you spend so much time deliberately antagonizing leftists with your conduct and the way that you write about them, which they did talk about, necessarily people are going to have this presumption of good faith erode. And I have to tell you, Conor, and this is one of the sort of thing where I think that you and I are just never going to agree. I think that your presumption of good faith makes no sense to me. And I think that you can look at the internet every day, and what the presumption of good faith does is it lets dishonest people win arguments because they don't actually always believe the things that they say. They don't always mean them in the best sense possible. And, I'm always...
Wait, hold on. Of course not. And there are all kinds of people where I don't presume good faith. Basically every talk radio host that I repeatedly attack, I think, is acting in bad faith. There are whole swaths of people who I think, and explicitly right, are just exploiting people for money. It's like a core critique I have of the conservative movement. But if you're going to accuse people of bad faith, right? I accuse Glenn Beck of bad faith when he tries to fool his viewers into buying gold at marked up prices by telling them that an apocalypse is coming and these coins that he just happens to get a percentage of, right? That he should buy those, right? I have a reason to presume bad faith. Like I said, Matthew Yglesias does not have a stake in Bangladeshi shirt factories one way or another. There's no social prestige attached to coming down on one side or another of this question. He doesn't have any corporate ties to shirt factories or cotton farmers or whatever it would be. There's no reason to think that he's acting in bad faith in this post. There's no economic incentive. There's no social incentive. There's just no reason for it. And I think that it is wrong to accuse people of bad faith or treat them as if they are writing in bad faith when there's no reason for doing so.
Whether he's in good faith or not, I disagree with him, and other people disagree with him. And the way that we disagree is a profoundly moral disagreement. And one of the exact things that drives me crazy about how people argue online is always to try to avoid the moral condemnation and just sort of say, hey, well, I still want to be able to go out for drinks with this person, which is exactly why we cannot create certain kinds of change. The fact that we live in a system that is speeding so much money. I mean, I don't need to tell you about all the studies that come out month after month about the absolutely absurd and accelerating amount of money and resources that go to the people at the top. And it's simultaneous to that, people who make $38 a month in a factory in Bangladesh get crushed to death because their boss said you got to get back to work in a building with cracks in the foundation. My only natural reaction to that, the only way that I can live with myself, is to permit myself genuine human anger. And it seems to me that everybody in the professional media, or 90% of them, work so hard to deny that anger, to make that something that you should feel ashamed of, to make it something that is not the right way to do things. And
yeah, I agree that anger. I agree that anger is sapped out of a lot of content in the professional media, and that is sometimes a bad thing. And I would not have objected to this post at all if it was just an angry, morally outraged refutation of Matthew Yglesias, right? But that's not what it was. Like I said, my objection was partly that it did not, in fact, correctly represent his argument. It was partly that it did not actually refute his argument, and it was partly that it cruelly mocked his physical appearance. And I think it's important to highlight here what the effect is of cruelly mocking his physical appearance is, right? This has happened a lot of times to Matthew Yglesias. The guy has thick skin. I'm not worried about Matt. What I am worried about, and what the effect of this is, first of all, is to make most people who don't already agree with you completely reject a post out of hand without even considering its content, right? But the thing that I'm more worried about, right? It isn't Matt Yglesias. It's the kid sitting in a journalism school somewhere, or sitting in his undergraduate dorm or her undergraduate dorm, with aspirations to be part of this national conversation in the way that I am or in the way that you are, right? And they're thinking about maybe starting a blog. They're thinking about maybe they want to go into professional media, and maybe they like Matt Yglesias. Maybe they read around in the left-wing blogosphere, and they know that, maybe they're an awkward-looking person who knows that they don't have the thick skin to put themselves out there in this way, who knows that they, because of their insecurities, if someone were to mock their physical appearance in this way, and this is especially true, this is a huge reason why women have not blogged in as great numbers as men, because of the kind of cruelty and mockery, specifically about sexuality and physical appearance in their case, that is directed toward them, right? That is the cost of the kind of bullshit I'm going to ridicule someone's physical appearance to show off my moral outrage because I'm morally justified in doing it. It's bullshit, and those are the people that it hurts, and those are the kinds of people that it pushes out of the media, not Matt Yglesias, who has thick skin and who it has no effect on. It's basically like completely counterproductive and I would say like deeply morally suspect. And I think that it's like a preening moral outrage. Oh, I'm so morally outraged that I'm justified in doing anything, no matter how much it transgresses against normal norms, because this person's blog post is just that morally outraged.
Well, look, Conor, I mean, I don't think that I've ever said anything about Matt Yglesias' appearance. I don't, if I ever did, then I'm sorry if I have. I certainly don't, I'm not a supermodel myself. I will say this. I worry, too, about the young left-wing guy who wants to get into the media. I worry about that kid, too. But I don't worry that he's going to be scared off of it because somebody's going to make fun of his appearance. I worry that he is going to be like Matt Yglesias in his recline, which is someone who was a left-wing person and who gets into an angry left-wing person, someone who says, you know what, the world could be a lot better than it is, and it's not anymore. And then they get into the Washington media scene, and it's this grinder, and it just shaves off all of their imperfections, and it shaves down that anger, and they get beaten down by going to drinks with the exact same people that they were just criticizing a minute ago, by the whole social circle and the professionalization where you say, well, I really hate this thing that was published in this magazine, but I might write for them someday, so I'm not going to say that nasty thing. That's who I worry about. I worry about the passionate, angry, left-wing person who has something of value to say, who's not going to say it because they're thinking, well, maybe someday I'll hold the Mickey Mouse endowed chair at Slate, and I'll make the $90K a year. That's who I worry about.
I think it's. I don't know that characterization of Matt is particularly fair. And again, I don't think that his Bangladesh post. I see no reason to think that it was motivated by anything other than a genuine belief that the policy he was arguing against would immiserate Bangladesh. That said, I think it's perfectly legitimate for you to worry about people getting co-opted by the DC media scene. And that's certainly something that we agree about, that is a problem. I don't think Matt is a particularly good poster boy for that problem. Maybe we just disagree about that. We're way over time, but I'd like to maybe come back the next time we talk to address like working standards in countries like Bangladesh and kind of get into the merits of that. And maybe we can exchange some links and maybe we can get to this article on Denmark and their welfare system too.
It sounds like fun. I'll see you at Ezra Klein's potluck tomorrow night, right?
Thank God, no.
Yeah.
All right, man. It was good talking, and I will see you hopefully somewhere far from DC sometime.
All right. Talk to you soon.